Sabine De La Roche clutched her journal tightly as the shadows of the De La Roche mansion stretched across the cliffs, unaware that the very person she trusted most was orchestrating the nightmare that would destroy her family forever. The De La Roche family had long been admired as one of the most respected households in Brenton Hollow, a small coastal town where everyone knew one another's history but rarely dared to speak it out loud. Their stone mansion stood high on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic, a fixture of the landscape as solid and unchanging as the rocks beneath it. The family name carried weight, money, tradition, and influence woven together through generations. To outsiders, the De La Roches looked like a portrait of elegance and stability, the kind of family that seemed immune to the storms that rattled ordinary lives below the cliffs. Laurent De La Roche built much of his reputation through philanthropic ventures. Residents saw him as a man who genuinely cared, someone who donated to schools, funded community centers, and hosted charity auctions that raised impressive amounts. He was the kind of figure newspapers admired, featuring him with glowing praise and calling him the backbone of Brenton Hollow's cultural development. His wife Amelie matched his grace with an artistic brilliance that never missed the eyes of the town. She led a foundation supporting young painters and sculptors, often visiting struggling students and gifting supplies with quiet generosity. Together, they projected a life of harmony and accomplishment. Their children fit perfectly into this polished picture, or so it seemed. Sabine, the eldest, stood out with her intelligence and poise. At 17, she excelled academically, performed beautifully on the piano, and turned heads at charity events with her grace. Her talent was undeniable, and many predicted she would one day step into her mother's shoes, carrying the family's cultural influence forward. Julien, the younger sibling, was different, quieter, more introspective. At 10 years old, he often retreated into books and puzzles, expressing himself more through quiet actions than words. People saw him as gentle and sensitive, a boy who found comfort in the sanctuary of his family home. For years, the De La Roche Thanksgiving celebration had been one of the town's brightest traditions. Their doors opened to extended relatives, close friends, and even new arrivals to Brenton Hollow. The manor would glow with warm light, filled with music and the aroma of elaborate dishes. The town loved the glimpses inside this prestigious family's life. Those nights were reminders that beneath the polish and privilege, the De La Roches could be warm, welcoming, and deeply generous. But traditions can crumble long before the world notices, and the cracks inside the manor had begun spreading months before that final Thanksgiving night. At first, the changes were subtle. Laurent cancelled several public appearances, citing exhaustion. Amelie grew distant, often isolated in her studio for hours, without producing a single new piece of art. Staff members whispered about a growing chill in the home. Sabine withdrew from friends, offering vague excuses. Even young Julien sensed something strange, waking frequently from nightmares he could not explain. Bria Calder, the housekeeper who had served the family for a decade, noticed the transformation more sharply than anyone. She understood the rhythms of the household well enough to sense when something disrupted the delicate balance. She found shattered glass in a trash bin one morning, though she remembered no accident occurring. She found bloodied tissues flushed halfway down the toilet. She overheard muffled arguments through heavy doors. She watched Sabine move through rooms with the rigid tension of someone carrying an unbearable secret. Laurent's once confident stride became heavy, disjointed, as though he carried a weight he could not name. Amelie began sleeping in a separate wing of the mansion, an abrupt shift from years of unity. She often held something small and velvet-covered, a box she never allowed anyone to touch. Whatever was hidden inside seemed to follow her everywhere. Her gaze changed too, becoming haunted, vigilant, as if expecting something terrible to appear at any moment. As November approached, the family's behavior grew more unpredictable. Sabine packed a suitcase one afternoon, stuffing it with frantic urgency, before Laurent intercepted her. The bag vanished, and she returned to her routine with forced calm. Bria sensed danger escalating, but fear held her back from confronting anyone. She considered leaving her job but worried for the children, especially quiet Julien, whose nightmares had worsened. Thanksgiving week arrived with an unnatural stillness hanging over the estate. For the first time, the family cancelled their annual gathering. No relatives, no friends. The staff were instructed to finish their duties early and leave by 5 p.m. It was a decision that baffled the town and unsettled the workers who had always witnessed the celebration firsthand. By Thanksgiving morning, Bria felt a chill she couldn't shake. The house looked the same, grand, polished, imposing, but something beneath the surface felt unstable, as if the foundation itself had begun to crack. The walls seemed to hold secrets that no one dared voice. The air carried a tension she could not explain. She lingered at the front door a little, longer than usual before leaving that evening, glancing back at the darkening windows of the mansion. Something about the silence made her heart pound with dread. Inside the De La Roche estate, the final Thanksgiving night was beginning. And by the time Dawn returned to the cliffs, 3 members of the family would be dead. Thanksgiving night settled over the De La Roche estate like a thick, heavy blanket. The cold wind swept in from the Atlantic, rattling the hedges and pressing itself against the windows, as though trying to warn the occupants inside. With the staff gone and no guests invited, the mansion felt unusually hollow. The familiar sounds of bustling preparation were absent, replaced by the low hum of appliances and the distant crash of the waves below. The cliffs. Laurent moved through the kitchen with slow, deliberate steps. He insisted on handling dinner himself that year, refusing help from anyone. He checked the oven repeatedly, adjusted the temperature, and hovered near the counter as if searching for something he had forgotten. His movements were meticulous yet frantic, as though the act of cooking served as a distraction from whatever haunted him. Every few minutes, he paused, placing a hand on the counter to steady himself, his breathing growing uneven. Amelie wandered through the main floor, holding the small velvet box she had kept close for weeks. Her fingers traced its corners compulsively. She drifted between rooms with an unfocused expression, pausing in doorways as if listening for someone who wasn't there. Her eyes were hollow, fixed on memories she wouldn't share. Occasionally she approached Laurent, only to retreat seconds later, clutching the box tighter, her pace quickening as she avoided confronting what lay between them. Upstairs, Sabine sat curled in a corner of the library, her phone glowing faintly in her trembling hands. She stared at messages that gave her no comfort. Messages she had read dozens of times. Each word seemed to tighten her chest further. Her pale face reflected the screen's light as she scrolled through instructions she no longer wanted to follow. She deleted a few, restored others, then locked her phone abruptly, pressing it against her forehead as if trying to silence her own thoughts. The weight of her secrets felt unbearable. Something she had agreed to now terrified her. Julien, unaware of the deeper tension, sat in the living room with his building blocks. The simple task of constructing small structures calmed him, grounding him in a way nothing else could. He looked up occasionally at the dark corners of the room, sensing a strange heaviness in the air. He didn't understand what was wrong, but he felt it like a low vibration beneath the floorboards. He moved his blocks closer to the couch and continued building, seeking comfort in proximity to something familiar. The clock approached 6:17 p.m. when the first unusual sign appeared. The security cameras lining the property began flickering in and out, cycling between static and brief visuals of the grounds. The malfunction lasted only seconds, but it was long enough to interrupt every feed simultaneously. Later, investigators would debate whether someone interfered with the system intentionally. At the moment, no one inside the mansion noticed the disruption. Moments after the cameras glitched, the power went out. The entire manor plunged into darkness. The hum of appliances ceased. The faint warmth of the lights vanished. Only the distant roar of the ocean and the sudden pounding of wind against the windows filled the silence. Emergency lights flickered on after several seconds, casting an unsettling glow over the rooms. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, creating warped shapes that made the house feel stranger than ever. Laurent rushed toward the hallway, his silhouette slicing through the dimness. Amelie froze near the staircase, gripping the velvet box with both hands. Sabine jerked upright in the library, her heart hammering as she stared at the faintly illuminated doorway. Julien's blocks toppled as he scrambled toward the nearest source of light, covering his ears from the abrupt silence. From that point onward, the timeline grew blurry, fragmented pieces of motion, emotion, and fear that no living eyewitness could fully reconstruct. But investigators later pieced together the order of events from the physical evidence left behind. Laurent was the first to fall. He was found near the dining room, slumped over a chair that had snapped beneath him. His head showed a deep, forceful wound, consistent with a heavy blunt object. Yet there were no signs of a prolonged struggle. The room remained largely undisturbed, suggesting he was taken by surprise. Amelie died in the kitchen. She collapsed near the oven, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had been standing moments before her death. The toxin in her system acted quickly, but investigators later discovered faint dark residue on her fingertips, implying she may have unknowingly handled something deadly. Sabine died last. Her body was discovered the next morning on the rocky edge of the cliffs below the estate. The investigation revealed she had fallen from the patio outside her room around 11 p.m. The timing placed her death long after her parents. Whether she slipped or was pushed remained a question that would haunt the case for months. Only Julien survived. Found hours later by responders who arrived after a neighbor reported strange movement near the cliffs. He was curled inside an antique wardrobe in the guest room, trembling so violently he couldn't stand. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused, and his small hands clutched a blanket so tightly it tore at the edges. He said nothing, not a single word, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. When dawn rose over the cliffs, the truth of Thanksgiving night remained buried beneath silence, shadows, and 3 bodies that told 3 different stories. The De La Roche estate, once a beacon of elegance, now stood as the center of a tragedy that defied easy explanation, and the investigation had only just begun. Detective Rylan Mercer arrived at the De La Roche estate just after sunrise, his breath visible in the cold morning air as he stepped out of his vehicle. The mansion loomed over the cliffs in grim silence, its elegant facade now overshadowed by the emergency lights scattered across the property. Mercer had handled difficult cases before, but something about this scene felt different, too orderly in places, too chaotic in others. It was as if the tragedy inside had unfolded in layers, each hiding a deeper truth beneath it. The first thing Mercer noticed was the lack of forced entry. Every door and window remained intact, no signs of prying tools, no broken locks, nothing to suggest an intruder had stormed into the home. The snow-dusted ground surrounding the manor showed no footprints, except for those of first responders. This immediately made him suspect the killer had been inside the house long before the murders occurred. Inside, the atmosphere felt almost preserved, as if the air itself held on to the night's tension. Laurent's body lay near the dining room, and the heavy wound on his head drew Mercer's attention immediately. The indentation suggested a blunt object with a wide, solid base. The problem was that no such object could be found anywhere in the room. The chairs were intact, except for the one beneath him. The table showed no signs of struggle, and the shelves remained perfectly arranged. The absence of a weapon struck Mercer as intentional. The kitchen where Amelie died raised even more questions. Her body was found collapsed beside the oven, with no external injuries. Toxicology would later confirm poison, but Mercer noted the subtle dark residue staining her fingertips. It looked like she had touched something moments before ingesting the toxin, something that acted quickly and left no trace elsewhere in the room. He scanned every surface, every container, every utensil, but nothing seemed out of place. The countertops were spotless, the dishes were untouched. There was no obvious source of contamination. The poison had entered her system in a way that left almost no footprints. Sabine's case introduced a completely different complication. The girl's fall over the cliff occurred hours after her parents' deaths. The timeline perplexed Mercer. If all 3 victims had died close together, a singular motive or rapid incident might make sense. But the separation suggested either premeditated staging or panic-driven action. Her room offered faint clues: an overturned glass, a smear of something along the balcony railing, and a window left slightly ajar despite the cold. Mercer suspected she tried to escape something or someone, but his team couldn't be sure whether she fled voluntarily or was forced toward the cliff. Julien, the sole survivor, remained unreachable. Trauma locked him in silence, leaving Mercer without a living witness. The boy's hiding place, a wardrobe in the guest room, raised another question. How did he know to hide? And what had he seen or heard before, retreating into the darkness of the antique cabinet? Mercer began interviewing anyone connected to the family. The housekeeper, Bria Calder, became a crucial voice in the early stages of the investigation. She hesitated at first, scared and emotional, but eventually shared details that had been troubling her for weeks. She mentioned the shattered glass she had found in the trash, the bloodied tissues, the distant arguments she couldn't fully hear, and Sabine's failed attempt to pack a suitcase. Among these clues, Mercer detected a pattern: fear inside the household long before Thanksgiving. The autopsy reports finally arrived, deepening the mystery. Amelie's poison was identified as a rare substance derived from an Eastern European plant, almost impossible to obtain without a specialized network. Laurent's head wound suggested a single, precise strike, delivered with significant force. Sabine's body showed no signs of struggle, but her palms were scraped, indicating she had tried to cling to something during her fall. Mercer expanded his investigation beyond the crime scene, digging through financial records, digital communications, and security logs. He discovered that the family's security system had experienced repeated malfunctions in the past month: random outages, unexplained resets, and interference. The footage from Thanksgiving night, stored off-site by the estate's tech contractor, had been partially corrupted. Most frames were useless, But one single captured moment changed the direction of the case entirely. At 6:18 p.m., seconds after the power outage, a dark figure appeared near a side entrance of the manor. The figure was slender, hooded, and small, approximately the height of a child. The image was grainy, distorted by the flickering camera, but the outline was unmistakable. Mercer froze as he replayed the frame repeatedly. If the figure had entered the house at the time of the outage, then Julien was not the only child-sized presence inside the manor that night. Julien, according to the paramedics, was too traumatized to walk, much less roam the dark estate during the murders. So who or what matched the size and silhouette of a child entering the home? As Mercer studied the image, a thought crept into his mind, unsettling and unwelcome. Perhaps the tragedy of the De La Roche family was not the culmination of internal conflict, but the work of a hidden force that had been quietly dismantling their lives long before Thanksgiving night. And if that was true, then the real culprit had planned every moment with chilling precision. The De La Roche murders were beginning to look less like a domestic implosion, and more like the execution of a calculated plan. Detective Rylan Mercer's suspicion deepened as he focused his attention on Sabine De La Roche, the quiet 17-year-old who had always been portrayed as the family's shining light. Within the town, people described her as polite, brilliant, and mature beyond her years. But the Sabine reflected in her digital footprint was vastly different, fragmented, and drowning beneath the weight of something far more sinister than teenage rebellion. Her bedroom revealed the first undeniable cracks in her composed facade. While the room appeared neatly arranged at first glance, Mercer found subtle inconsistencies. Sheets stripped from the bed and lying in a crumpled heap, notebooks with missing pages, and a small safe tucked behind a stack of sketchbooks. The safe held encrypted flash drives, a prepaid phone, and handwritten notes, filled with codes Mercer couldn't immediately decipher. Sabine had been hiding parts of her life, carefully curating what others saw and locking away the rest. Her laptop became the investigation's turning point. Mercer's team established she had been communicating with a mysterious online presence known only as Holopoint. The username appeared across multiple encrypted messaging platforms, all routed through layers of anonymity that pointed to someone highly skilled. The conversations between Sabine and Holopoint were fragmented due to Sabine's attempts to delete them, but the recovered portions painted a bleak picture. Holopoint fed into Sabine's insecurities, reinforcing her belief that her family was suffocating her, and that escape was the only path to freedom. Worse, the tone of the conversations shifted over the months. What began as sympathetic messages slowly evolved into manipulative suggestions, isolating her from her parents, urging her to distrust them, and eventually encouraging dangerous behavior. Sabine had been groomed, emotionally manipulated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit her vulnerabilities. And Sabine's vulnerabilities were deeper than anyone had realized. Hidden in her encrypted journals were entries describing overwhelming pressure from her parents' expectations, growing fear of her father's temper, and a sense that her mother was hiding something terrible. She wrote about hearing whispers, hallucinations she believed were warnings, and described nights spent crying in her room while feeling trapped inside the walls of the estate. Mercer recognized the signs of deteriorating mental health, worsened by the influence of someone exploiting her state. One of the journals contained an alarming passage written just 2 days before Thanksgiving. Sabine described a plan involving a reset, something she claimed would end years of unhappiness. She referenced a guest who promised her freedom and hinted at a dramatic shift that would occur after dark. Her writing became increasingly unstable sentences, fragmented words, repeated thoughts spiraling into destructive patterns. While analyzing Sabine's digital communications, Mercer's team traced Holopoint's IP routes through multiple countries. Eventually, the trail led to a runaway named Isolde Karrin, a 21-year-old with ties to extremist online groups specializing in psychological manipulation. Isolde vanished from official records months earlier, but her online presence resurfaced sporadically, always connected to vulnerable individuals she influenced before disappearing again. Sabine was not her first target, merely her most high-profile one. The discovery that Isolde had been in contact with Sabine for over 2 years sent a shockwave through the investigation. But the true horror emerged when Mercer found evidence suggesting Isolde had not remained behind a screen. Several days before Thanksgiving, security logs captured an anomaly, a manually overridden side entrance, recorded at an hour when the family was asleep. The entry time matched a period when Sabine had been awake. According to her online TIMESTAMPS. This was when Mercer realized Isolde Karrin had physically entered the De La Roche estate. The grisly events of Thanksgiving night were no longer the actions of a single individual in the house, but the culmination of an infiltration. Isolde had stepped out of the digital shadows and into the family's home, embedding herself in Sabine's psyche and manipulating her further. Sabine, already emotionally unstable, was transformed into a vessel for Isolde's agenda. Tracing the toxins in Amelie's body provided more confirmation. The substance was nearly identical to one used in prior cases linked to Isolde's network. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a signature. Sabine didn't have the means to acquire such a rare poison, nor the knowledge to prepare it. The residue on the girl's belongings indicated she had handled materials under someone else's instruction. Mercer could now picture the unsettling sequence of events. Isolde slipping into the manor under the cloak of darkness, manipulating Sabine into preparing parts of the plan, exploiting her mental distress, and positioning herself as both mentor and instrument of destruction. Sabine's fall from the cliff no longer appeared accidental nor sudden. Mercer believed, she realized too late, she had been deceived. Her attempt to escape the manipulation likely ended in Isolde forcing her over the ledge. Julien's survival suddenly made sense. He had heard unfamiliar footsteps, sensed danger, and hid instinctively. Isolde likely overlooked him in the chaos. The realization struck Mercer with chilling clarity. The De La Roche murders were orchestrated long before Thanksgiving night. Isolde Karrin had executed a systematic psychological dismantling of Sabine, using her to infiltrate the family, destroy their unity, and ultimately eliminate them. The carefully cultivated image of the perfect family had made them the perfect target, and the mastermind behind it all was still out there. Detective Rylan Mercer knew that Chapter 5 of this case, the part no one wanted to confront, demanded stepping into the cold, silent spaces left behind by the dead. The De La Roche mansion was once again sealed off, its ornate halls transformed into a haunting reminder of what had unfolded. Mercer walked through the estate with a clearer understanding of the mechanics behind the crime, but still lacked the conclusive thread tying everything together. He needed a narrative supported by evidence, not instinct. His first focus was reconstructing the timeline from the moment Isolde Karrin gained access to the property. Security footage showed only shadows and glitches, but the side entrance door displayed faint markings, barely noticeable scratches that suggested someone had tampered with it repeatedly over several nights. Lock specialists confirmed that the marks were consistent with manual lock bypassing. That meant Isolde had likely entered the home more than once, studying its layout and observing its inhabitants while they slept. The thought chilled Mercer. The killer had lived among them for nights without detection. Inside the house, he retraced what Sabine must have witnessed. He imagined her walking through hallways she knew by heart while carrying the burden of Isolde's poisoned guidance. Sabine's journals, once decoded, revealed a terrifying level of dependency. She referred to Isolde as a mirror, someone who reflected the darkness she felt inside, but in a way that validated it. These entries showed a girl who had become convinced that the only way to free herself was through destruction. Mercer realized that Sabine, though a victim of manipulation, had also taken part in actions she believed were her own choices. He reviewed the forensics again. The poison found in Amelie's system had been delivered subtly, likely through her evening tea ritual that she always performed herself. But someone had tampered with the ingredients hours earlier. Fingerprint analysis revealed smudges consistent with Sabine's gloves. Yet the gloves bore chemical traces matching Isolde's supply kit, not anything the De La Roche family owned. This meant Isolde had prepared the poison, and Sabine had unknowingly been the one to place it within reach. Sabine believed she was helping initiate her reset, but she never understood that the dose was lethal. Marcel's injuries told a different story. He had fought fiercely. The pattern of bruising suggested a struggle with someone smaller but fast, someone who used precision rather than strength. Isolde, trained in the manipulative tactics of extremist circles, likely incapacitated him with the same toxin in a weaker form before delivering the fatal injury. The positioning of his body showed he had tried to reach a phone but collapsed midway. Sabine, according to journal entries, had hidden herself in the music room during the violence, believing she was following instructions meant to protect her from witnessing what she assumed was a symbolic cleansing. She had no idea someone was physically murdering her father. Mercer's reconstruction of Sabine's final moments was perhaps the most disturbing part. Evidence on the cliff soil sampling, scrape patterns, and footprints revealed that two people had been present during the fall. Sabine's prints were heavy, irregular, indicating she had run or staggered. The second set, lighter and more deliberate, were confirmed to be feminine but unmatched to family members. Isolde had pursued Sabine, likely after Sabine realized something was wrong. The journal's final page, scribbled, incomplete, revealed. Sabine spiraling panic. She wrote about the mirror breaking, a realization that Isolde's promises were lies. The missing chunk of the page bore an indentation of a sentence Mercer could barely read. She wants the ending to be mine. The cliffside examination supported the theory that Sabine had turned back, possibly trying to flee, and then been forced over by Isolde. Though the sea had washed away much, investigators found a piece of fabric snagged on jagged rock, a fragment of a black sleeve made of a synthetic blend often used in tactical clothing. It didn't match anything Sabine owned. As Mercer pieced these elements together, a disturbing picture emerged. Isolde had orchestrated every action leading up to that night, manipulating Sabine to carry out minor tasks that appeared harmless until they became part of a deadly plan. She leveraged Sabine's fragile mental state, using her as both accomplice and scapegoat. The official narrative could have easily concluded that Sabine was solely responsible, but Mercer refused to accept such an incomplete truth. What troubled him most was the realization that Isolde's method mirrored past unsolved cases. Families destabilized, vulnerable individuals coerced, and final outcomes staged to look like acts of internal collapse. Isolde chose the De La Roche family because of their influence, privacy, and Sabine's emotional instability. She had no personal connection to them. They were simply the next canvas for her psychological warfare. Mercer concluded that Isolde never intended to stay in the shadows forever. The loose ends, she left behind traces of her signature poison. The encrypted messaging routes, the fabric near the cliff, were not mistakes, but reminders. She wanted someone to know she had been there. Perhaps she even wanted recognition. Standing in the De La Roche dining room where the family once gathered, Mercer felt the full weight of the case. The evidence now pointed to a chilling truth. Sabine had been weaponized. The murders were not a crime of passion or family breakdown, but the work of a manipulator who thrived on orchestrating destruction. And somewhere beyond the reach of the investigators, Isolde Karrin was already preparing her next target. Detective Rylan Mercer sat alone in his dim office, surrounded by stacks of notes, transcripts, forensic logs, and psychological assessments. Chapter 6 of the investigation was not an extension of the crime itself, but a descent into the mind behind it. Mercer knew that solving the De La Roche murders was only half the battle. Understanding why they happened was the key to preventing the next tragedy. The deeper he dug into Isolde Karrin's past, the more he realized he wasn't dealing with a conventional killer. Her patterns weren't impulsive or born from financial motive. They were ideological, crafted from a warped worldview, shaped by years of control and indoctrination. He began by analyzing her early life, piecing together fragments left behind through sparse public records and testimony from those who once knew her. Born into a nomadic commune with strict hierarchies, she was raised in an environment that preached self-erasure and obedience. The commune, later dismantled for psychological abuse and financial exploitation, had conditioned its members to detach from personal identity and seek purification through acts of sacrifice. Isolde grew up immersed in these doctrines, absorbing them as truths. When the commune dissolved, she didn't adapt to normal society. She carried its philosophy into her adult life and warped it further through her own interpretations. Mercer realized that Isolde's manipulation of Sabine De La Roche was not random. She gravitated toward individuals with emotional fractures, people whose vulnerabilities made them receptive to her influence. Sabine, isolated by pressure and overwhelmed by expectation, became the perfect candidate. Isolde didn't seek a partner or follower. She sought someone who could be molded into an instrument of her ideology. In Sabine, she found a mind quiet enough to fill and break at will. Mercer's attention then shifted to the encrypted messages Isolde had exchanged with Sabine. The investigators had finally decrypted several more segments. The language was chilling. Abstract metaphors about cleansing, liberation, and the beauty of endings. Sabine, desperate for meaning and connection, interpreted these phrases as guidance. Isolde had constructed an emotional maze designed to keep Sabine dependent. Each message pushed her deeper into a disconnected state, blurring the line between reality and the twisted doctrine Isolde imposed on her. Mercer reviewed the psychological evaluations again, comparing Sabine's known tendencies with behavioral cues found in her journals. Her writings revealed a girl searching for a sense of purpose beyond the polished world she inhabited. The immense pressure of being a De La Roche clashed with her fragile disposition. Isolde recognized this gap instantly and positioned herself as the one who could fill it. Sabine's journal entries became progressively darker, shifting from insecurity to fatalism. She wrote about being unworthy, about needing to shed herself, about becoming light enough to disappear. These sentiments were not born from her mind alone. They were seeds planted by Isolde Mercer, turned next to the broader pattern. The De La Roche case wasn't Isolde's first. It was merely her most elaborate. Authorities in 3 other countries had classified similar incidents as isolated family tragedy, suicides, accidental deaths, mental breakdowns. But Mercer saw connections the earlier investigators had missed. In each case, there had been a vulnerable individual. In each case, a mysterious outsider had entered their life before disaster struck. In each case, the outcome was catastrophic. And in each case, the outsider vanished afterward. Isolde's method was surgical. She didn't kill simply to kill. She disassembled family ecosystems, dismantled emotional structures, and watched them collapse under pressure she herself engineered. She believed she was carrying out a form of ideological cleansing, ridding the world of corrupted foundations and false identities. It was a mission, not a crime. Mercer knew that catching Isolde would require unraveling not only her movements, but her belief system. He contacted cult psychologists, extremist behavior analysts, and ideological violence experts. They all agreed on one chilling point: Isolde was not finished. Individuals like her, driven by distorted philosophy rather than personal gain, did not stop until they were forcibly halted. The more Mercer learned, the more a sense of urgency grew. Isolde had left too many intentional breadcrumbs. She wanted someone to know she existed. She wanted her work recognized, and recognition often preceded escalation. Mercer placed his notes aside and stared at the investigation board. The faces of the De La Roche family stared back at him, Amelie's steady gaze, Marcel's stern posture, Sabine's quiet, uncertain eyes. They were victims, but their story was also a warning. As long as Isolde remained free, the pattern would repeat. He understood then that Chapter 6 of the case was not about concluding anything. It was about preparing for what lay beyond. Isolde Karrin was not a figure who vanished after a single tragedy. She was a force waiting to strike again. And Mercer, now armed with the full picture of her methods and motives, knew he had become part of her next game. Detective Rylan Mercer entered Chapter 7 of the investigation with a growing sense of unease. The case had shifted from a closed-circle family tragedy to a hunt for an ideological predator who thrived on invisibility. Every new detail about Isolde Karrin revealed her as more than a manipulator. She was a strategist who understood how people unraveled. Mercer needed to anticipate her next move. But that required stepping into a mindset that resisted logic and warped morality into ritual. He had spent months studying her history, her language, and her methods. Now he needed to track her in the real world, where she moved like a ghost. The task force assembled around Mercer was small but experienced. They began by analyzing Isolde's known movements in the weeks leading up to the De La Roche murders. The woman had traveled through several towns, using forged identities crafted with meticulous care. Each alias had a distinct background, job, and purpose. She collected them like masks, wearing each one long enough to blend in, but never long enough to leave digital footprints. Surveillance footage showed glimpses of her, a woman with unremarkable features, always dressed in neutral colors, always glancing slightly downward, as if calculating exits. She walked among crowds without drawing attention, the kind of person people forgot minutes after passing. Mercer requested travel records from bordering regions, focusing on lodging logs and rental agreements. Under the false names she had used in the past, patterns emerged. She favored isolated rentals, paid in cash, and stayed only a few days at a time. When investigators searched one abandoned rental cottage, they found a small notebook hidden behind a loose floorboard. The pages contained fragmented thoughts written in a style eerily similar to her commune's teachings. Phrases about disassembling foundations, guiding fractured vessels, and purity through severance filled the margins. Mercer studied the entries with a growing chill. The notebook wasn't a confession. It was a blueprint. He realized that Isolde viewed her victims as pieces in a ritualistic cycle. She didn't choose families randomly. She chose structures she believed were fragile or morally tainted. The De La Roche family, with its strict reputation and internal disconnects, had fit her criteria perfectly. Mercer now wondered how many other families she had evaluated before targeting them. Another break came from a forensic linguist who analyzed both Isolde's notebook and the encrypted messages sent to Sabine. The linguist identified subtle shifts in syntax and vocabulary that indicated Isolde tailored her language to each victim, molding her words to match their psychological weak points. To Sabine, she wrote in abstract poetic metaphors, appealing to insecurity and yearning. In earlier cases, she used harsher, fragmented phrases for individuals she needed to destabilize aggressively. The discovery reinforced Mercer's belief. Isolde was a psychological chameleon, adapting her manipulation strategy with surgical precision, while Mercer studied her ideology. Analysts examined financial traces. She had no stable income, yet she traveled freely. Investigators found irregular purchases of specialized chemicals, encrypted communication tools, and survival gear. These were made through dark web vendors using cryptocurrency wallets that were cleaned regularly. The level of sophistication suggested she had been taught these methods, or had learned them, gradually through trial and error. Mercer suspected she had been part of a decentralized network left behind after her commune dissolved. Individuals scattered across regions, but connected through ideology. If that were true, then Isolde wasn't a lone operator. She was the strongest branch of a dead tree, still poisoning the soil beneath it. The next revelation came unexpectedly, when an informant contacted authorities claiming he recognized Isolde's face from Mercer's circulated sketch. The man, a former member of an extremist survivalist group, admitted that Isolde had once passed through their camp, offering philosophical lessons to members seeking guidance. She spoke to them about liberation through detachment and purification through collapse. Her ideas were rejected by the group leaders, who found her methods too unstructured and unpredictable even for their standards. She left after 2 weeks, leaving behind followers who were so disturbed by her influence that they abandoned their own group shortly after. The informant described her presence as quiet chaos, a person who dismantled belief systems without raising her voice. This testimony confirmed Mercer's fear. Isolde didn't simply prey on families. She infiltrated closed communities as well, testing their psychological defenses. The De La Roche family had merely been her most recent project. Mercer's final breakthrough came from an unexpected angular pattern analyst on the task force who correlated Isolde's past appearances with unusual incidents. Reported shortly afterward, these incidents included disappearances, fires, and mass psychological breakdowns within isolated communities. None were traced to her officially, but the timing was too precise to dismiss. The analyst created a heat map of these occurrences, revealing a path that formed a rough arc across 3 countries. The arc ended near a mountainous region known for retreat centers and spiritual enclaves, places where individuals sought escape from the pressures of modern life. Mercer stared at the map in silence. If Isolde had retreated there, she might be preparing her next ideological purification. Chapter 7 closed with Mercer standing before the investigation board again. Aware that he was no longer investigating a static crime scene, he was following a living force that adapted and evolved. Isolde Karrin was not simply hiding. She was moving forward with purpose, leaving behind patterns that only someone willing to see beyond the surface could follow. And Mercer knew he was running out of time to stop her.